Tonight's speaker or presenter is Rick Klinedinst. He is from Tazewell County, and he is going to speak on Camp Ellis, its history and its activities, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you.
So, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me here this evening. I guess I have John to thank for that, right? John was at Tazewell County when I was there, so.
It was John's suggestion.
Yeah.
He thought it would be a good program.
Yeah. Actually, I was born and raised in Canton and never left. So, in my spare time, I do banking, but I usually talk on Lincoln. I'm a Lincoln enthusiast, so I've done a lot of programs on Lincoln. In the past year, I've been asked to do some things on Camp Ellis. So I'm sure many of you have heard about Camp Ellis in some fashion or another, right? Anybody have any relatives that work there?
No.
Yeah, I know there's one. I'll talk about you in a minute. Anyone been there?
Yep.
When it was open?
No.
Okay.
He drove past it.
Yeah, you drove past it, yeah. And I'm sure a lot of you have many stories about Camp Ellis, or you've heard many stories about Camp Ellis, but you know, if you served there and you were 18, if you went into the service when you were 18, you'd be 98 today. So I doubt if anyone was actually there operating, you know, when it was in operation and working there. So, but anyway, there's a lot of great stories, and I know some of you have already told me some stories, and I know this young lady has done a presentation, so she's here to grade me to make sure I get it all right. So she gave a presentation, I guess, on Camp Ellis, so that's exciting. So why Camp Ellis for me? Well, when I was growing up in Canton, we spent a lot of time, my dad was from Ipava, and my mom was from Astoria, so we spent a lot of time down in that area. And I started dating a young lady back when I was 17 or so. She lived about 2 miles from the entrance of Camp Ellis. So when I would go down there and visit her, I would get on her dad's motorcycle and I'd kind of ride back through where Camp Ellis was. And my cousin, one of my cousins from Ipava said, you know, Rick, there's still Japanese POWs wandering around out there, so you need to really watch them. And so when I'd get on the motorcycle and ride back through there, yeah, I'd kind of look over my shoulder a little bit sometimes. I wouldn't stop for very long. But, you know, come to find out there were never Japanese POWs there. They were all Germans. So anyway, you know, here I am 42 years later after I married that young lady. So, and her sister is here, Cindy, and her husband, Rafal. Cindy also grew up in Ipava, a couple miles from Camp Ellis, and you can still see some remnants of Camp Ellis from their backyard. And I know she's done a lot of running back through there and, you know, playing and that type of thing. So anyway, we'll get started here, and stop me if you got questions. Kind of run through this, and again, let me know if you got any questions. So, you know, so World War II was kind of gearing up, and the United States had a growing need for training facilities throughout the country. It was originally called the Lewistown Project because they had an office in Lewistown, and they were kind of designing the camp in Lewistown. It was going to be a training for soldiers, foot soldiers, and so then later they changed it to Camp Spoon River, because Spoon River ran through there, and then later they changed it to Camp Ellis. But again, the directive then became, when it became Camp Ellis, the directive became a training center for services of supply, not foot soldiers, services of supply. So why did they pick this location? Again, some of you have driven through Ipava, right? So why did they pick this particular area in the country for a training camp for World War II? Well, the short answer is it had access to railroads. It was relatively open and cheap. It was flat land, so it wasn't going to take a lot to demolish it. And they had availability to fresh water, Spoon River. And also the site wasn't close to distractions. They didn't want to be by major cities because that was too much of a distraction for their servicemen. So there's actually very little written about Camp Ellis. You know, historians really haven't written a lot about it. And I'm going to have a lot of handouts for you tonight about a lot of the things that I'm talking about here this evening. So most of what I'm talking about tonight, you're going to get a handout. So, but again, despite the thousands of men and women that went through Camp Ellis, there's really not a lot out there. But Camp Ellis honors Machine Gun Ellis. His name was Machine Gun Ellis. He was a World War I hero. He took out 60 German machine gun nests in one day. And so they nicknamed him Machine Gun Ellis. And that's who the Camp Ellis was named after. So again, Camp Ellis was designed to train men in Army supply and support forces, not combat, not foot soldiers. It was the only such camp like that in the country at the time. And so a lot of the men that came here, they were enlisted men. You know, if you enlisted, you kind of got your choice of where you wanted to go. If you were voluntold to join, then you really didn't have a lot of choice. And a lot of those people were then trained in combat. But for those enlisted men, they got to pick where they came to. So Camp Ellis accommodated a full division of soldiers. They trained over 300,000 men in the time that they were open, the short time that they were open. And it was in quartermasters, it was in medical corps, signal corps, engineering, ordnance, transportation, and special service troops. Eventually they trained 456 units of special forces that ranged anywhere from 48 different types of things, from small medical detachments that had less than 100 men, or 12 men, to larger detachments of hundreds of men. So when they trained here, they all then went as a group. That particular regiment went overseas, and they stuck together overseas when they were supporting the forces. So imagine this. In 1942, if you lived in Ipava, Table Grove, or Bernie Dot, and you drew a line from Ipava to Table Grove to Bernie Dot and back to Ipava, kind of a good left-handed triangle, right? 1,100 people at that time in 1942 lived in this triangle. 1,100 people. So within a short few months, this grew to 50,000 people. Can you imagine 50,000 people almost overnight coming to this triangle? 50,000 people. Today, that's about the size of Normal, Illinois. 50,000 people. So you can imagine what it did to those little towns, right? I mean, they didn't have a lot of services and places, and the construction people had to have places to live. The restaurants were just bursting at the seams and that type of thing. So back in 42, it was second to Chicago in population when it was fully going, 50,000 people. The work began in September of 1942 is when the people came in, the construction workers and that type of thing came in and started building Camp Ellis. So the government drew up plans and surveyed over 17,800 acres of farmland, which was purchased. And so a lot of those farmers and their families were displaced within 30 days. They had to evacuate within 30 days. So, many of these families own these farms since the 1800s. So it not only created a physical separation from their homes, but also a very emotional separation from their homes. Camp Ellis swallowed up over 125 farms, and the government, they condemned these properties. That's how they took this property over. They condemned them, and they paid up to 60% of the value, or sometimes even less than that. So they really weren't kind to those farmers, especially when, again, they told them to get out. So a lot of farmers had crops already in the ground and that type of thing, and so they didn't have a choice. A little bit later, they added 1,800 acres on the east side of the camp, kind of over here for their airport. They wanted to have an airport out there. So in all that, there's 19,600 acres that it consumed. So to complicate matters worse, in the winter of 42, it didn't cooperate. There was a lot of rain, it was cold, it was hot. Illinois, right? Just wait till tomorrow and it changes, they say. But they called it Swamp Ellis for a period of time because, again, they said you could stand in mud up to your knees with dirt blowing in your face. But when they started building this, there was a lot of rain, and like the Illinois River had flooded in many places and that type of thing. So it was a really difficult place to build. So Camp Ellis meant jobs were plentiful in construction trades as well as ancillary communications, transportation, record keeping. So the people in the area really were able to obtain jobs out here at the camp and help not only build the camp, but also to keep the camp going. It had plumbing, water treatment, sewage, phone lines, recreation buildings, kitchens, mess halls, parade grounds, headquarter facilities, roadways, post offices, telegraph, shooting ranges, equipment depots, everything a small community needed. Also, just a small community in itself needed. So again, the small towns around Camp Ellis really exploded overnight. It was really good for their economy. So this is the main entrance. So Camp Ellis became pretty much a small city within a short 8 months. From September 1942 to mid-43, more than 2,200 buildings were built in that triangle. 2,200 buildings in that short period of time. They were a theater of operations. So the types of buildings that were mostly wood, and they were faced with like fireproof sheetrock or gypsumite, that type of thing. So they're kind of cheaply made for the most part, or thrown up. They're thrown together. There were 18 camp exchanges. Stores were all over the place. There were 6 auditoriums, 9 chapels. I'll tell you why they had 9 chapels here in a little bit. 2 libraries. They had 2 service clubs, and they had 2 guest houses. Again, this is the main entrance. The sign is still there on the main gate in US 136. So the barracks were hastily constructed during the winter and spring of 42-43. Most rested on 2-foot square concrete corner footings that was raised above the ground. And I'm sorry you can't see these very well, but again, they were made of a cello siding. It was kind of a fiberboard that they were made out of. Each barracks had about 50 men in the barracks. No running water, dimly lit. There was 2 stoves on each side of the barracks. That was their heat. And can you imagine what it was like in the summertime? It just they were very cramped in there. But you can see in some of these pictures, they hung their clothes up in the rafters and that type of thing. And it's just very crude. But they threw them together within a short period of time. So Camp Ellis opened in April 43. It was dedicated on July 4th of 1943. The Illinois governor, Dwight, was there. Also, Ellis's widow was also there. There's 50,000 people that came, and there's already a ton of people there. I can't imagine, how they got all those people, probably 80, 90,000 people in that little triangle. They said that the roadway to get to Camp Ellis that day was backed up past the Havana Bridge. So if you've ever been that way, Havana is about 20 miles or so from Ipava, and it was backed up way past that bridge. So at its peak, Camp Ellis reached numbers of 40,000 servicemen. It had 1,500 civilian workers, men and women, and of course then you throw in the residents there, so it was nearly 50,000 people. And like I said, at the time it was second to Chicago in population. One of the neat wonders of Camp Ellis was the Station Hospital. It was one of the largest World War II hospitals in the country. It occupied 140 acres of land. And one of the corridors, they said, was nearly 3,000 feet long. 3,000 feet. You know how many football fields that is? Just a little over 8 football fields long. That's how long one of the corridors was. That's how big this Station Hospital was. And again, there was nothing like it in our country. It had nearly 1,400 beds. There were 125 of those beds were for the POWs. There were 500 nurses that worked there that attended the sick and the wounded in 3 different shifts. Many of the people that they treated were returning casualties from the war. They'd send them back and be treated here, and also the POWs and the service personnel were also treated there. It had all the modern technology. Had the X-ray, the latest X-ray machines, surgical and diagnostic machines, equipment, that type of thing. But it also, they performed the first brain operation here. They flew in a doctor, a brain surgeon, I can't remember where, from California, and they performed the first brain operation here at this hospital. WWII. So Camp Ellis was home to the early prototype of what was first called a flying jeep. But it later became known as a Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, MASH, right? MASH TV, they made this famous, these MASH units. Yeah. This is where they pretty much invented the MASH unit, was here at Camp Ellis. It had everything necessary for a hospital. It had the equipment, the tents, the medical supplies, surgical tools, power generator, and they had a Jeep that outfitted as kind of an ambulance. And they trained the medical personnel here. So what they would do is they would load 3 or 4 C-47 airplanes and into all this equipment and the Jeep into these airplanes. They would take off from the airport, fly around for a little bit, land, and then set up a MASH unit. And they would do that for 2 or 3 days. Then they would pack everything up, put it back in the plane, get up, and they would take. That's how they train for these MASH units. So, again, it's interesting that the MASH, what we see on TV today, for MASH, it was actually, they invented it here, or they put it in practice here. So, one of the other wonders of the camp was this airstrip. They built this airstrip. I said that they bought an additional about 1,800 square feet, or took over about 1,800 square feet to build an airport. And this is the track that they would use. This is a still girder-like thing. They would lay this down over the land. This is the runway. You can still see one of these at the museum that I'll tell you about here in a little bit. But one time they built an airport 58 feet long. It took 1,000 troops 24 hours to build this airport using these steel girders. And again, it kind of helped them understand the terrains and how to lay these steel girders in that to build these temporary airports. Later on, that they added hangars to that area. But what they do is they would learn how to take off and fly from there, take off and land, and they would bring in medical supplies and other personnel that was delivered to the airport. This is them on that night, 24 hours to build a 150-foot wide, 5,800 feet long airport. So most planes that took off from Camp Ellis were actually these little Stetson L-54s. They were small planes. There weren't big military planes that came into Camp Ellis. But down here is one of the C-47s. So the C-47s, did land and take off from Camp Ellis. Again, those were for the MASH training units. Camp Ellis trained almost every type of medical unit in operation. Again, from 11-man malaria control to 1,000-bed general hospital and medical battalions. And so many of these, again, this group would go over together and they would stay together for most of the war. They had schools for cooks, bakers, truck drivers, unrated medical personnel, surgeons, x-ray technicians, dental assistants, pharmacy technicians. This is one of the bakery units, and kind of an interesting story with the bakery is when they were overseas fighting, they would bake about 500 loaves of bread a day. They would take kind of a hillside and make an oven out of it, and they would bake about 500 or 500 loaves of bread each day in the field. Again, trained here at Camp Ellis. Has anyone ever heard of the Village of Seven Hills? That's what Bernadotte was called originally. It was called the Village of Seven Hills. And anyone been to Bernadotte? Okay, a few of you have. And it's called Bernadotte, not Berno. Let's see, how was it?
Bernadette.
Yeah. Bernadette? Yeah, it wasn't Bernadette. Bernadotte. So, but Bernadotte, small town, was completely taken over. The government took it over. They made all the residents vacate their homes and their properties, and they bought them at condemned prices. So why did they need Bernadotte? One of them was, again, for their water supply. They needed a water supply for that. The other was they dammed it up. If you go out down there, the dam that's there, they built that at this time because they needed to back up that water for their supply. The second reason was for training engineers to build bridges. So what they would do is they would build a bridge across Spoon River, they would tear it down, they would rebuild it. Time and time again, they built several types of bridges. They built suspension bridges, pontoon bridges, steel girder bridges, strong enough for tanks and that to go over. And they would usually build these within 72 hours. That's what they trained for. They built nearly 300 different bridges across Spoon River College, or Spoon River College, Spoon River. And this is one of the pontoons that they're building there. So Camp Ellis, they maintained several large gyms, like I said, where troops, they formed teams. They had basketball teams, boxing teams, physical weightlifting teams, all kinds of indoor sports. Soldiers, they played tennis, bowled, volleyball, tackle football, touch football, archery, badminton, roller skating, horseshoe pitching. Teams from Camp Ellis, they competed against a lot of the Midwest colleges and they were very good. So if you think about it, a lot of these enlisted men were somewhat professional athletes, and so they needed something to do, and so they formed these teams that would compete not only against other Army bases, but they would compete against other colleges in the Midwest. Now, one time the camp had 184 softball teams, and they in organized leagues, and they had 124 basketball teams. That they would go out and compete against other colleges and other Army installations. So there were 9 different official postcards, and these are linen postcards. They call these linen postcards, and I have them back here, and you could also feel them here. These are linen postcards. Here's the next 4. There were film theaters, there were concert halls, libraries, places of worship were scattered throughout the camp. They would show first-run Hollywood movies at these theaters, at these 6 theaters. I mean, they were first run at every one of them. And sometimes, they would show movies to about 40,000 Army men and civilians during the week's time. So back then, this was open to the public. You could go out there and go to these movie theaters as a civilian. They're not closed. This base wasn't closed like it is today. The camp was visited by Joe Louis. You know who Joe Louis was? Great boxer. Brought a young Sugar Ray Robinson with him. It drew a crowd of nearly 25,000 people to their boxing exhibition. White Sox pitcher Bill Frazee was there at one time. Bob Feller came and visited there he was a Cleveland Indians pitcher. Movie stars would come and entertain the troops. People like Red Skeleton came to Camp Ellis. They even say Bob Hope came to Camp Ellis. But Camp Ellis was open to the visitors, so thousands of people visited and attended the various events that the camp put on. And then this is the last, what I call the official linen postcard from Camp Ellis. You'll find a couple other postcards from Camp Ellis. This one here, I have no idea why they have this, because these planes didn't land at Camp Ellis. They weren't even close to Camp Ellis. But for some reason, there's that one. And then this is a telephone one that just mentions Camp Ellis. So Camp Ellis also published its own newspaper. It was called Camp Ellis News. It began in April of '43. It was very small. It was a 4-page newspaper, and it increased to 16 pages in circulation, over 13,700 circulation at its peak was given out. It ceased publication shortly after VJ Day in August of '45. And again, I got a couple samples back here for you to look at, but I also have a copy of one for you to take home with. It's interesting to read through these. You got to remember the times. It's a very racist newspaper, and it's a very racy newspaper. So I'll just warn you ahead of time. So prepare yourself. But you got to remember the times. So people wanted news and entertainment, so they also had their own radio station. It was called the Camp Ellis Entertains. And so it would broadcast nearly 200,000 listeners each week would tune in to Camp Ellis Entertains and listen to the various news and things, activities and that type of thing going on at Camp Ellis. Again, this is a small city. It's a newspaper, so a radio station. It even had its own fire station. This is a picture of their fire station. Their firemen. So there was a water treatment plant and there was a sewer plant out there. They removed these a couple years ago, unfortunately, but they went out there and started reclaiming some of the land out there again and removing a lot of these different structures that you would see. As I said, it even had its own telephone company. It was called Camp Spoon River. It was operated through Illinois Bell. It had 35 switches. It had 1,000 lines, and a 3-minute call to Chicago cost about 75 cents a minute, and that didn't include tax. But even the servicemen were charged to make phone calls. There was even a banking facility out there that was ran through Citizens National Bank in Macomb.